Exclusive polling. We debut an EWTN News Real Clear Opinion research poll on the faithful and their attitudes leading to the 2020 presidential election. Moving forward, Democrats continue hearings on the impeachment investigation into President Donald Trump. We have team coverage. Spreading the faith. A cardinal from the Philippines gets a new job as the head of one of the largest departments at the Vatican. And the Immaculate Conception. How Pope Francis honored the Blessed Virgin Mary on one of the most important days on the church calendar. On EWTN News Nightly for Monday, December 9th, 2019. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining us for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Wyatt Goolsby. Tonight, EWTN News Nightly is launching the results of an in-depth look at Catholic voters in America. EWTN News has partnered with Real Clear Opinion Research to bring exclusive polling ahead of the 2020 presidential election. The results give us a clear look at the issues Catholic voters are concerned about, as well as a look at the church in America. Joining me now are Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief of Real Clear Politics, John Della Volpe, Director of Polling at Real Clear Opinion Research, and Matthew Bunson, Executive Editor for EWTN News. Welcome to all of you. I want to get started with you, Matthew. Tell me overall here, what was the purpose of this survey? Why did EWTN News want to do this?
Well, if EWTN News is going to serve the church and inform Catholics everywhere about the events in the world and where we are as a church in the United States, we need to have a very clear idea of where Catholics stand politically, but also how Catholics are living their life and where they're living their life. And so we see this as part of a service to American Catholicism, but also to the universal church. But we also see this as a kind of diagnostic tool, as a way of understanding where are the crisis points in the church in the United States. And once we have that kind of diagnosis, it's going to be up to the experts and church leaders to come up with prescriptions for where we go forward from here.
And it is a very interesting survey. John, I want to ask you, there's so many politicians over the years that talk about wanting to get the Catholic vote. They want to get out there and get those voters. But based on all of this information that we now have, is there such a thing as a Catholic vote?
Absolutely. And it's one of the most critical building blocks, I think, of any winning coalition. In fact, for most elections over the last 50 years or so, the one group that has been most predictive of the popular vote winner has been Catholics. So understanding, tuning in to what Catholics think about politically is critical for any successful campaign, especially in a general election. Overall, the Catholic vote represents about almost a quarter, 22 to 24 or so percent of all votes cast, and we'll get into it a little bit later, but there are constituencies within that voter block as well, so it's not a monolith, but there is, well, certainly a Catholic vote. That vote in 2016 mirrored the popular vote almost perfectly.
Very interesting. So Carl, to follow up on that, what do you think are the biggest takeaways from the poll, and especially as we look ahead into this new election year?
Well, I'd say two things, and the first is, just following on what John said, devout Catholics are very much still with this president and with the Republican Party, but they're with Donald J. Trump. And, that it mirrors, this poll shows, it's the mirror image of what's going on in the evangelical church, in the Protestant church, which is where the mainstream Protestants and the younger Protestants are less likely to be Republicans. But evangelical Christians who are devout, who go to church regularly or identify themselves as evangelicals, they're a powerful voting bloc. If you combine them with these devout Catholics who go to Mass once a week or more, now you're talking about a coalition. Maybe we ought to be talking about the Christian vote in journalism and political science, because that's the thing that most struck me about this. But the other thing is, and this, if you're a Democrat, this would be in your favor. The Republicans don't have an unlimited number of election cycles. Next year might be the last one where they can, with the status quo the way it is, because younger Catholics, like younger non-Catholics, are less likely to be Republican, less likely to be liberal, or less likely to be conservative on these issues, and less likely to support the president. So those two takeaways struck me.
It is interesting to look about some changing demographics there. John, was there anything in terms of this data that surprised you or stood out to you?
I do think the changing demographics, and to just to add some more to that is the difference between the generations. Difference between the generations is significant, and for the first time, we'll have more younger Americans, younger Catholics voting than older Catholics voting in 2020. So that's something that's worth keeping an eye on as well. But this is the first of a series of polls that will be conducted over the next year, and this is essentially kind of a baseline to understand kind of where the Catholic vote is today, where the similarities are with the overall general electorate, generally, where the differences are, where the similarities are, and how the vote kind of emerges and changes, if it does, over the next year or so. And we have a lot more questions to ask.
Sure. Well, and one thing too that this poll tends to confirm, so it's less of a surprise as much as it is a confirmation of the rising influence of Latino Catholics on American Catholicism. 37% in this poll. We know that any sort of factoring in of where the Catholic vote is going to go, now we have to pay very close attention to Latino Catholics.
And like you said, that's so consistent with what we've talked about on this program. So John, you are confident about the accuracy of this survey?
Of course, and to make sure that we're accurately representing 37% of Catholics, we conducted the poll in English as well as in Spanish, because oftentimes, people more comfortable with one language tend to answer questions differently than others. So we did that. This includes, several thousand registered voters. We oversampled Catholics. We're able to look at Catholics based on gender, based on age, based on race and ethnicity, et cetera. And again, this is just a snapshot in time. But what is unique about this poll is it's over 100 questions long, but it's less about what's happening today in terms of predicting the election and more about the underlying issues and values of this vote and how those, I think, will ultimately be kind of a lens of which we hope that the audience as well as candidates can kind of connect with them.
We're going to continue to talk more about the survey in the coming days, so I want to thank you all for being here. Matthew Bunson, John Della Volpe, Carl Cannon, thank you all so much. Joining me now with his thoughts and analysis is Robert George, Mccormick Professor of Jurisprudence at Princeton University. Welcome back, Robert. I want to start off by asking you the same question I asked our panel on the poll. Is there a Catholic vote?
No, there's not a Catholic vote, and there hasn't been a Catholic vote for a long time. Catholics, taken in the aggregate, tend to line up on political questions pretty much the way the country does. There's not any distinctive margin for Catholics being conservative or being liberal, or really strictly speaking, being Democrat rather than Republican. A greater percentage of Catholics are Democrat than Republican, but not all that much greater. And the way it cashes out in elections is that Catholics in general will sometimes be a majority for Democrats, sometimes be a majority for Republicans. So if you know where the American public in general is on a candidate or on an election or on a referendum issue, you'll pretty much know where the Catholics are, taken again in the aggregate. Now, within that, there's a lot of differences. There are age differences having to do with whether you're Caucasian Catholic or Hispanic Catholic. But again, taken in the aggregate, Catholics tend to look pretty much like America.
Catholicism certainly is very diverse. Let me ask you then, Robert, what do you see as the biggest takeaway from the poll heading into this election year?
Well, actually, what I was struck by and concerned about wasn't so much the political stuff. It was how so many Catholics, including those who are in the most devout categories, don't know the teachings of the Catholic faith. This is a failure of catechesis on the part of the church that is massive. So even if you take the most devout Catholics, those who believe all of what the church teaches or most of what the church teaches, only 66% of those believe in the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist. You can't get a more fundamental teaching to Catholicism than the idea that the bread and wine are the body and blood of Christ, not just a symbol for those things, but are the body and blood of Christ. But here, a very large percentage, a third of your most devout Catholics in the country don't understand that well enough to believe it.
How would you describe how Catholics view the president in general, less than a year out from the presidential election?
Again, in the aggregate, and we could break it down, but in the aggregate, Catholics are like other Americans. The president could be reelected or he could lose. It's going to depend on what happens between now and then. And my guess is that Catholics will reflect pretty much the population as a whole. If the president ends up winning 51-49 or by an electoral college majority without a popular vote majority, you'll find that that pretty much reflects where Catholics, taken again in the aggregate, ended up being in the election. So Catholics don't stand out here. They're just like other Americans, or like Americans on the whole, again, in the aggregate.
Finally, I want to ask you a bigger question, a little more general question. Where is the country right now politically? I mean, we have an impeachment looming, the start of an election year right around the corner. How would you assess where we are?
Great uncertainty. That's my assessment. Donald Trump could be reelected. He could be defeated. He could be impeached. I think won't be removed, but even if he's impeached, he could still be reelected. I think that's entirely possible. Or he could be impeached and fail of reelection. It is simply impossible right now to say where the American public is going to be on Donald Trump in November. Now, remember, you've got a strong economy. You have historical lows in black unemployment, in female unemployment. You have an overall employment rate that's very high, and that ordinarily bodes very well for incumbent presidents. We are not reading about our soldiers being killed every day in a distant war. More or less peace and more or less prosperity tends to bode well for presidents. On the other hand, Donald Trump is a very divisive figure, and he arouses fierce passions from his supporters, but also from his opponents. So no one could predict, no one can predict right now how this is going to end.
Well, there certainly are a lot of questions going into 2020. Robert George, McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence at Princeton University, thank you so much for joining us.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Wyatt.
To see the full results of the polling and to learn more, go to EWTNnews.com/poll. We will have more analysis tomorrow here on News Nightly. The House races towards a vote on articles of impeachment against President Donald Trump. Democrat and Republican lawyers butted heads during a testy hearing on Capitol Hill. Democrats say the president should be impeached. Republicans say he did nothing wrong. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi brings us the highlights. Jason?
Wyatt, the House Judiciary Committee could vote on charges against President Trump this week. That includes abuse of power as well as obstruction of Congress. Now, this case all centers upon President Trump holding up aid to Ukraine and then urging that country to investigate Joe Biden's son. But Republicans say this is just because Democrats can't beat Trump at the ballot box. Protests inside the hearing room as House Democrats get close to wrapping up this impeachment probe.
Did the evidence prove that President Trump was a threat to our elections?
Yes, it did, Mr. Chairman.
Democratic lawyers lay out their evidence.
The first excuse offered by President Trump is that the aid was ultimately released and President Trump met with Mr. Zelensky. We heard it today. The challenge with that, though, as an excuse, is the aid was only released after President Trump got caught doing the scheme.
A Republican lawyer counters that argument, pointing to another call before news broke of the withholding of aid.
In closing the call, President Trump told Senator Johnson that we're reviewing it now, referring to the security assistance. And guess what? You'll probably like my final decision. He told that to Senator Johnson on August 31st. This statement strongly suggests that President Trump was already leaning toward lifting the aid.
Then one of the Democratic lawyers cross-examined the Republican.
Miss Williams.
Sir, did you leave that out of your report, yes or no?
If you're telling me I did, I mean, I don't know as I sit here right now whether that's in the report.
I'm telling you you did.
Okay.
The two parties fight not just on impeachment, but procedure.
Then how many other rules are you just going to disregard?
The full House could vote to impeach President Trump by Christmas. It would then send it to the Senate for a trial, and that Republican-controlled chamber is likely to acquit. It would take 2/3 of the senators to convict. Wyatt?
Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi reporting. Thanks, Jason. President Trump continues to defend himself as the House moves closer to impeachment. He calls the inquiry a hoax and blames the, quote, do-nothing Democrats. White House correspondent Mark Irons has the latest from the president.
Never, ever should this happen again.
President Trump has long contended his name is cleared of wrongdoing.
He says the transcript of his July 25th phone call with the president of Ukraine proves that. During today's impeachment hearing, he tweeted, "Read the transcripts." Today, the Democrats' lead attorney in the impeachment investigation pointed out several concerns with the president's call, including his suggestion that Ukraine was involved in election interference.
And President Trump was referring to the baseless conspiracy theory that the Ukrainian government, not Russia, was behind the hack of the Democratic National Committee in 2016. Not a single witness in our investigation testified that there was any factual support for this allegation.
Today, the White House says data shows the impeachment hearings are actually benefiting the president.
I don't think the American people really have much interest in that. If you look at the polls, it's going in the other direction.
The impeachment thing is a total hoax. The numbers have totally swung our way. They don't want to see impeachment, especially in the swing states. They've swung our way. I've never seen a swing like this, because people realize it's a total hoax.
The president has also long called the Russia probe a witch hunt, but a new inspector general's report rejects the claim that it was illegitimate. At the White House, Mark Irons, EWTN News Nightly.
Coming up, an update on a pair of pro-life laws in the United States. And there's more lawsuits against former Cardinal Theodore Mccormick. A pro-life victory in Kentucky. The U.S. Supreme Court leaves in place a state law requiring doctors to conduct ultrasounds and show images of the baby to patients before an abortion. The justices did not comment on their decision. Doctors failing to comply face fines and can be referred to the state's medical licensing board. And in Alabama, the near total ban on abortion will remain blocked, at least for now. The state's attorney general's office says it will not appeal a federal judge's ruling, which stopped the proposal from taking effect last month. A lawsuit over the measure is currently being considered in the courts. New Jersey temporarily has lifted its statute of limitations on sexual abuse allegations. The move has already led to a pair of new lawsuits against former Cardinal Theodore Mccormick and two of his state's dioceses. The lawsuits allege Mccormick sexually assaulted two males while he was a bishop in New Jersey. One of them was a minor at the time. The suits also claim gross negligence by the Diocese of Metuchen and Archdiocese of Newark. The Vatican defrocked Mccormick earlier this year for sexual misconduct against minors and adults. A senior official in North Korea openly insults President Trump. The country's former nuclear negotiator says the president is a heedless and erratic old man. He also says Pyongyang will not cave to any U.S. pressure because it has nothing to lose. Yesterday, President Trump said on social media he hoped North Korea would not resume missile testing because it could endanger the country's, quote, special relationship. Authorities in Indonesia are planning to increase security over fears of a terror attack on or around Christmas. Officials say about 160,000 security personnel will be deployed. That number is more than double last year's total. There are 50,000 churches in the Southeast Asian country. Up next, how the Holy Father celebrated the solemnity of the Immaculate Conception. Pope Francis has appointed Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle the new head of the Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples. The 62-year-old Filipino cardinal succeeds Cardinal Fernando Filoni, who led the Vatican department for 8 years. Yesterday, the Holy Father appointed Filoni the Grand Master of the Order of the Holy Sepulchre after accepting the resignation of Cardinal Edwin O'Brien. With more on this new appointment, we're joined by Edward Pentin, Rome correspondent for EWTN's National Catholic Register. Edward, what can we expect from Cardinal Tagle in this new Vatican position?
Right, well, Cardinal Tagle has quite a lot of experience and enthusiasm for evangelization. He took part in the two big synods to do with this subject, the Synod on the New Evangelization in 2012 and the Synod on Youth last year, and he took prominent roles in both of those. So he's been very keen on this area for many years. But also he has experience in governing. He's been governing of one of the largest archdioceses in the world, which is Manila, and that will set him up well, people think, for this role as prefect of the Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples, because that's one of the largest dicasteries the Curia has. It has jurisdiction over nearly 200 archdioceses around the world and is responsible for supporting foreign missions. But also the other aspect to this is that he has experience, of course, in Asia. He is Asian, of course, but he also has ancestry which is from China. And so that is another factor here which is important to this role. And people think that because the focus of the church is very much more on Asia and particularly on China, his appointment is very fitting because of that.
Like you say, a very important position. Tell us about Cardinal Filoni's new role as Grand Master of the Order of the Holy Sepulchre and how that will be significant for Middle Eastern Christian communities.
Yes, well, Cardinal Filoni takes over as Grand Master of this ancient chivalric order which dates back to the Crusades. Today, though, it basically provides financial support and a lot of moral support for Christians in the Holy Land. But Cardinal Filoni brings with him some experience of the region because he was actually Apostolic Nuncio in Iraq during the Iraq War and actually stayed there during the hostilities. So he has experience of the region, and it's thought that he can also bring his expertise from his previous role of Propaganda Fide, the Congregation of the Evangelization of the Peoples, to this new role, which is very much focused on the Holy Land and Christians suffering there.
And of course, we'll continue to pray for all those Christians who are suffering there. I want to switch gears and ask you about one other thing, Edward. As tradition, Pope Francis visited a statue of the Virgin Mary in the center of Rome to celebrate the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. What was his message?
Yes, well, he gave a very heartfelt prayer at this ceremony, which he goes to every year. And he said that Our Lady reminds us that we're sinners, but not slaves to sin. And he also urges us not to be discouraged by sin. But he also talked about what he called the crystal clear purity of Our Lady, which he said calls us back to sincerity, transparency, and simplicity. It was a very strong message and, as I say, very heartfelt, and I think was very well received by the people there.
Very good. Yeah, it does sound like a very important message and one we can all take to heart. Edward Pentin, Rome correspondent for EWTN's National Catholic Register. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Watt.
Pope Francis says he is praying for peace in Ukraine.
Con una preghiera intensa, che lì ci vuole la pace.
At his Sunday address to pilgrims at the Vatican, the Holy Father also reflected on the Solemnity of the Immaculate Conception. He asked the faithful to say yes to whatever God asks us to do. He says the model is the Blessed Virgin Mary. Like her, we can say yes to God by being humble and helping others. The Angelus address wasn't the only way the Pope honored Mary yesterday. The Holy Father visited a statue in Rome dedicated to Our Lady. He says small gestures can improve a city's life and make vicious people become virtuous. December 8th is the traditional start of the Christmas season in Rome. It's also a national holiday in Italy. Finally tonight, Pope Francis makes a surprise stop during his already packed schedule. The Holy Father visited a Vatican exhibit displaying 100 nativity scenes. A choir from Hungary performed music in the background. He also talked with the artists who created the creches and their families. Earlier this month, Pope Francis said he hoped nativity scenes would become prevalent in workplaces, schools, and in the homes of the faithful. And of course, we are already starting to see nativity scenes being set up in homes and churches right here in the United States. And with that, we thank you for watching tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Wyatt Goolsby. We'll be back tomorrow with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night, and God bless.